Nakumi, a big thank you to having me here. It's a real honor and a huge pleasure to be able to share some of the work that I've been doing over the last 5 years. And my talk is not gonna touch on canoeing very much. I think I made one canoe is in the is in the very last slide. But on a personal note, I was really privileged to grow up going to Quebec Provincial Park, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, for a month every summer. So certainly a lot of these talks have resonated really strongly with me that way. But what I'm going to be talking to you about today is my work in Nunavik, looking at beluga whale habitat ecology. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about beluga and move into the story of beluga in Nunavik. And I think you'll see that it's quite a complicated story. And then move into my own project. And so my first introduction to belugas was probably through, I think it works on here too, I think. Yeah, I'm good. Oh, it's okay. So my introduction to belugas was probably through through the song Baby Beluga through Raffi, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And over the course of probably the last 5 years, my connection and my understanding of belugas has, I think, changed considerably from when I was 4 years old. So beluga live in discontinuous congregations across the Canadian Arctic, and they live in matrilineal-driven site fidelity areas. So what that essentially means is that each beluga will return to the area where their mother has summered for thousands and thousands of years. Beluga are also quite a long-lived species, and that also comes with a really long reproductive rate. And so that will be really important to keep in mind as we go through the story of beluga, because it has ramifications in how they can recover. And so thanks to Ken. You've had a great introduction to Inuktitut, and I certainly learned a lot. And one other thing that I wanted to point out is that Inuit means the people of this place, but Nunavimmiut means the people from Nunavik. So when if I slip into talking about Nunavimmiut, it means the people from that place. Likewise, if you're from Avuyavik right here, you're Avuyavimmiut, and that means you're from that place. So there's 4 Inuit regions across the north, and where I'm going to be focusing today is in Nunavik. And the 2 populations of beluga whales, there's 2 populations of beluga whales that summer in Nunavik, and that is this population here, the Eastern Hudson Bay population, and then the Ungava Bay population. And both of these populations are considered endangered under the Committee on the Endangered Status of Wildlife in Canada. The Eastern Hudson Bay population is quite small, but is still it's about 2,000. And this population is so small that it's believed to be possibly extirpated from the area. And what else is important to note is that though I'll mostly be talking about these Eastern Hudson Bay populations, there's also a fairly large population which overwinters in the Hudson Strait and then migrates through and goes over to the Western Hudson Bay, and that's a considerably larger population, which is also part of the harvest that's going on in Nunavik. So beluga are an incredibly important resource for Inuit. They're important from an economic perspective, from a food security perspective, and certainly from a integral to Inuit culture. And here you have, this past summer I was very fortunate to be in Avuyavik when they were doing the community harvest. And here's a picture of Huitzek on the far left to you. And Huitzek is looking out over Hudson Bay and looking for beluga that are migrating by. And beside him, you can see that's Salmoni Ainalik, and he has holding a piece of muktuk in his hands. And this is at a hunt that happens later this week. And the hunt really serves as an opportunity for the whole community to come together. It actually happened on Canada Day, right as they started singing "O Canada." Shots rang out, and then the whole community came to join this feast. and the butchering of the whale. And it really serves as a way of facilitating community cohesion and a way of celebrating being Inuit. So why are beluga endangered in eastern Hudson Bay? And this is a picture from some archives, and what happened around the mid-1800s is that the Hudson Bay operated a commercial whaling operation out of particularly the area around where Noah now lives, around Nastapoka and Great Whale River. And they took, over the span of approximately, over less than 10 years, they took about 8,000 whales. And the whaling continued for probably another 15 years, and then likely stopped because the population had been completely decimated and was no longer profitable. And then, as I had mentioned already, beluga are an incredibly important resource for Inuit, and particularly from a food security standpoint. I'm sure many of you who have been fortunate enough to visit communities in Nunavik have also probably gotten to go into the co-op stores and have noticed that the prices of food are astronomical, and that the options and the quality of the food is also not that great. So what beluga also represent is a really nutrient-rich food source. They're incredibly high in vitamin D, which you might also imagine is quite difficult to get in an area that doesn't have as much sunlight throughout the whole year. And they're also very high in essential fatty acids. So here you can see this is this is a modern-day harpoon. Traditionally, this would have been likely a seal stomach, and now in this particular one has a gas can attached, and so this is used to stop the whale from being lost during the hunt. And then what Nunavik is also, as some of you are probably well aware, it's got the youngest and the fastest growing population probably in Canada, with 14% of the youth, or sorry, 14% of the youth are under the age of 4, which is astronomical. And so the pressure that puts on elders and on families for providing for their kids also plays into this story. And then the third series of stressors that beluga have to contend with, and Noah got into this a bit yesterday, was that there's huge environmental change going on in the Arctic. We see huge changes in sea ice melt, for example, as Noah was answering in his questions yesterday, and what that's meant is that it's opened up significant ice-free areas. And so, as you may have heard on CBC last week, killer whales making the news, and killer whales are migrating into the Arctic at rates that have not been seen before, and they certainly represent a huge increase in predation risk to beluga. And so what all this is my only graph, what all this has meant is that beluga continue to decline. We're not entirely sure why. It's a big question mark. As Noah was telling me at lunch, it's a big, many Inuit across Nunavik are really concerned and are really worried about why this is. And you can also see, the other thing that I wanted to show you with this was that there's huge uncertainty with trying to figure out how many whales there are. It's incredibly difficult to estimate any kind of marine mammal population, and particularly ones that spend most of the year in sea ice. So what all this has resulted in is an incredibly tense situation in Nunavik, where there's a lot of conflict surrounding beluga management, and lots of people on both sides. And these are some news articles from the Nunatsiaq newspaper over the last 15 years. And what I think, especially the lower one, points out, it shows that beluga hunters are openly flouting quotas, hunting regulations, sometimes killing females with calves in protected areas. And what it points out is one thing that's really common and is important to keep in mind, which is that there's a lot of miscommunication between scientists and Inuit, and that what scientists are saying does not always agree with what Inuit are seeing in their communities. And so what I'll be talking about later on is also about improving that communication so that we're both seeing the same thing and talking about the same thing when we talk about beluga. And this is just to show you that, so if you remember the Hudson Bay Hunt, and in 1 year they took over 1,000 whales. And now this is this past August, and the headline reads that hunters along the eastern Hudson Bay have already exceeded their quota of 9. And so what used to, I wouldn't say sustain, but what at one time was contributing 1,000 whales is now closed at 9 whales. So what is a potential solution to this? From my perspective, is to use a mixed methods approach to research, where you can bring together, in my case, Nunavik knowledge together with what's often called Western science, or in my case is aerial surveys. And the benefits of this are that it's particularly good at addressing knowledge gaps. It's really good at addressing complex questions, which is, I think, what we have here. And because it draws from the strength of both knowledge systems. And that the last thing is that it's really good at engaging communities in the research process. And the really important thing to keep in mind is that the question or the objective needs to be the same. But we need more than just those two knowledge bases. We also need to have knowledge linkages and exchanges going on. Because with that, we're able to come up with a more robust and comprehensive understanding of those questions. So where we have this really complex system going on, and we're not really sure what's going on, but we do have a common objective. Both Inuit and scientists really want sustainable beluga populations for generations to come. And so it provides this space or this opportunity to work towards that goal together. And so now I'm going to shift into talking a little bit about my work, and a lot of it has been in doing and partnered with 4 Inuit communities looking at Nunavik knowledge of beluga. And so my thesis work is really about developing a habitat model that looks to develop a more comprehensive and robust understanding of beluga habitat ecology, the kinds of areas that belugas are using, and also the interactions that they're having with different variables. So we do that by taking different habitat variables. This is Nunavik here in the dark, and this is showing sea surface temperature in August from 1 year. And then taking the aerial survey data and overlaying it over top of this to see which habitats beluga are using, and then also taking the Nunavik knowledge that's been mapped through a process that I'll describe in a little bit, and overlaying that also to see which habitats Inuit are seeing beluga use. So you remember the 2 different populations of belugas, and the 4 communities that I've been very fortunate to work with are Kujarapik, Huaktek, Kingswalujwak, and Nuvuyivik. And these communities were chosen to represent a wide geographic area, as well as for their regional expertise. Particularly, Huaktek and Nuvuyivik represent kind of migration bottlenecks where the whales are coming quite close by the points, and so they're able to hunt right from the community and have been hunting them for thousands of years. So the aerial survey data comes from systematic line transect surveys flown in eastern Hudson Bay in July and August. So here's one of the knowledge gaps that we have, is that the aerial surveys, while giving very exact locations about where beluga are very very temporally limited in terms of only happening in the summer and then not happening every year. So when augmented and brought together with Inuit understandings of the habitats that beluga are using, you can see how much better of a picture we can get about what beluga are using for their habitat. So the Nunavik knowledge of beluga has been done through a series of interviews. I did 40 different interviews with Nunavik. Here you see David Ukpik, and David's mapping a migration line on a map. And so these maps were then taken back and digitized so that they could be spatially referenced and used alongside the aerial surveys. What you also get with this type of map is that David's also describing what's happening on there. So you're getting information about how beluga are moving. And here's Sapa Fleming, an interpreter, and Willie Tuktu from Kujarapik. And they're using a pre-species field guide that we use specifically for the project. And it's available in Inuktitut and in English. And that allowed us to get to a level of detail about what beluga are eating that's previously not been able to be documented in the region before. And so after, the initial interviews, I went back and transcribed all of the interviews. It translated into roughly 1,000 pages of transcripts. And then using a qualitative software program called Vivo, which essentially just helps you to group common themes and to understand better the patterns that are going on in that project, or in that particular theme. I went back to the communities on 2 different occasions to bring back and share results to make sure that I'd gotten it right. And it also provided a really unique opportunity to discuss any of the things that I was still unsure of, and for them to raise points of clarification, and to also decide if there were things that they did not want shared more broadly. And so the first workshop was just with people who had participated in the interviews, and the second one was also with municipal authorities as well. And then this past summer, as I was saying, I was fortunate to be in Nunavik doing the final reporting at the same time that the beluga were coming through. It wasn't a coincidence. I was hoping that might happen. And so this is Huitzek and I, and we also got to do interviews with Huitzek out on the land where he's done some videos. So we're hoping to include that as well in the final book. So one of the things that's important to understand from a species management perspective certainly is how beluga migrate. And so because of the wide geographic area that was covered, people in Kingswalujwak used to often live in Kilinik, which is the top point here. And from that, they know that beluga have overwintered in this area here. And so they begin their migration here, but there's also whales that are overwintering here. And then they come past Huaktak, and over just the span of a week, they can make it all the way to Uvuyivik. And Uvuyivik is a really important point in the migration because it represents the split between that really large population that I was talking about before, the Western Hudson Bay population, and the Eastern Hudson Bay population, which is then going to come down to here. Another really important thing to know about from that same perspective of understanding how beluga are moving is about whether there's any kind of age or sex segregation, because if you're trying to figure out how best to harvest a population and you want to be harvesting, for example, young males, then you would want to know at what time those young males are going to be coming through. So especially in the Eastern Arctic, the understanding is that the first whales that come by, these are the older yellow belugas, and they're slightly yellow in color, and this is partly because they haven't gone through their annual molt yet. And there's also a teaching associated with these whales. And these whales, it's important not to harvest from these whales because they're seen as being the leaders of the rest of the beluga. And so if they're allowed to pass and to go through, then what will follow is larger groups of females and calves. And then following that is groups of juveniles. And Johnny George Ananak, who's from Kingswalujwak, he also taught me a really valuable lesson about communication, because how I started the interview at one point, the interview talks about when do you first see beluga whales, and Johnny said that he saw them, and this is through a translator, I should note too. So Johnny said that he saw them in July, and in my head I thought that was kind of strange because I had done a couple interviews in that community at that time, and other people had talked about seeing them much earlier, but I didn't think that much of it. And later on, he was talking about beluga being around much earlier, like at the beginning of May. And I said, but I thought you didn't see them until July. And he said, well, yeah, I don't see them until July, but I hear them starting like at the beginning of May because there's so much ice and they're moving between the ice and he can hear them breathing and he knows that they're there, but that wasn't what I had asked, which was very true, And another thing that we talked about, and that emerged out of the interviews was the different factors that are influencing the migration and how beluga are moving and when they're moving. And so one of those factors is sea ice. And for example, sea ice is one of the main determining factors about when the migration starts. So when they're up by Kaitlin, they're waiting until the ice has broken apart enough that they can start to migrate through. So it's really the determining factor of the start of the migration. And then from people in Kujarapik in the eastern Hudson Bay, we know that that's also one of the factors that's driving them out. So one could expect that if, speaking back to Noah's point about migration, about freezing coming much later, the beluga are staying later and later in eastern Hudson Bay than they were before. And we also talked about feeding, and so this is an example of a map that's showing all of the feeding areas that were marked by participants. So this again is from the 4 different communities, and what it's showing here is the lighter the color, the less common the observation was, whereas the darker the color, the more participants observed that area as being a good feeding area. We also talked a lot about prey species, as I was saying, and the only 2 that were common to all the different communities was Kaniuk and or shorthorn sculpin, and ugak, or Greenland cod. And then I don't expect you to read this, but I did want to share some of the participants' words, and these words are from Harry Ukpik from Huaktak, and Harry was telling me this amazing story about belugos, and it was a group of females and calves, and the females, Harry and a bunch of people were over by King Sujuak, which is just west of Huaktak, and there's really good char fishing there, and so they were there to char fish, and apparently so were the beluga, and the females left their calves by the river mouths and went out into the deeper water and schooled together a group of char and then pushed them back towards their young, and this so that the young could feed more effectively. And this is a really great example of cooperative feeding. Another thing that emerged out of the interviews was this really dramatic change that beluga appear to go through over the course of their year about in terms of their body condition, in terms of their blubber thickness. And so if we take a Vujovic, for example, when they come by in the springtime, they're quite thick in terms of their blubber. So their blubber is about 7 centimeters during that spring migration. And that's during June and July. And then when they come back in October and November, their blubber is considerably less thick and has decreased by over 50% in some cases. And so that has really, that could have potentially really big implications in terms of understanding how contaminants move. So contaminants often accumulate in the blubber. And as many of you know, the Arctic, though it doesn't contribute very much to the contaminants, is unfortunately a sink for contaminants. And so if beluga are going through this significant change in terms of their blubber thickness, what does that mean in terms of the contaminants that are in their systems? And here you can see, this is Sima Mark, and Sima is cutting up the whale from this spring, so you can see that the blubber thickness is quite thick. And Simon's cutting the blubber up into as many pieces as there are homes in the community. And then everybody comes down to the waterfront and takes their share of muktak. So what I hope I've been able to share with you quite clearly is the importance of Inuit understanding in contributing to our collective understanding of beluga whales, and also how valuable this is in terms of developing particularly a habitat model in my case. But I wanted to finish on a more personal note. This is during a verification workshop in Huaktak, and we're eating different muktak served a couple different ways. This is huak muktak, which is raw frozen muktak, and then we were also having some fried muktak. Looks kind of like shiitake mushrooms when it's fried, and is very good. It's very mamuktuk. And so for me, on a personal level, this project has been much more than just increasing the understanding of beluga. For me, it's really changed how I see the environment and how I see connections to species. And certainly, I've gotten glimpses into how profound that connection can be and how interdependent that connection can be. And I think much of what this conference has touched on is that part of the solution to a world that's going through vast and incredible amounts of environmental change is for us all to for us all to reconnect with the environment that we're a part of. So with that, I'll say nakumi, especially to the communities that I've been working with, and also to my partners and to the really generous funding support that I've received as well.